Welcome, everyone, to Emmett's weekly webinar featuring the always brilliant Behnam Ben Taleblu, discussing his recent report on deterring Iran's dash to the bomb. This report it's an important analysis, and I'm putting the link in the chat for everyone who's interested in reading it. So I'll do that in a couple minutes, and I hope you all take some time to at least skim it. It's quite informative. Iran's nuclear weapons program, it's been a focus of our work at Emmett, which we could not do without your continued support. I just want to thank you all for joining us and for supporting us. Please do save the date for our annual Rays of Light in the Darkness dinner, which will be held on November 19th in DC. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we hope that you share the link with your networks, as today's discussion is critically important as we head into the coming months. If you have any questions, you can place them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and please do limit your submissions to questions only. Behnam Ben Taleblu is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he focuses on Iranian security and political issues. Behnam previously served as a research fellow and senior Iran analyst at FDD. Prior to his time at FDD, Behnam worked on non-proliferation issues at an arms control think tank in Washington. Leveraging his subject matter expertise and native Farsi skills, Behnam has closely tracked a wide range of Iran-related topics, including nuclear non-proliferation, ballistic missiles, sanctions, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the foreign and security policy of the Islamic Republic, and internal Iranian politics. Frequently called upon to brief journalists, congressional staff, and other Washington audiences, Behnam has also testified before the U.S. Congress and Canadian Parliament. He is published extensively, and I urge you all to follow Behnam's important work, and you can also follow him on Twitter or X. Welcome, Behnam, and thanks so much for joining us this afternoon.
Lori, it's always a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me. Great to be with Emmett, and major props and kudos for the good work you and Sarah and everyone at Emmett does. Great to be in the trenches with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I know how busy you are. So before we dive into the report, I think everybody probably wants to hear what you have to say about the events of the past 2 days, beginning with pagers blowing up across Lebanon yesterday and today walkie-talkies, and the amazing ingenuity, presumably, of the Israeli military and technological industries. In the context of, obviously, Iran, because this is critically important, can you share with us your thoughts on what has transpired and what it means in the bigger picture of Iran's dash to a nuclear weapon?
Absolutely. Make no mistake, we shouldn't be following in the footsteps of the Biden administration, which has made some kind of philosophical and analytical mistakes when it comes to this region, disconnecting the dots between patron and proxy. And as you can see through not just this operation allegedly assumed by the Israelis, and as well as a whole host of other operations that we've seen from the Israelis that signal a change in risk-taking, that signal a change given the successes of the Gaza war, and given a potential vector of change, given how surrounded and how many fronts are increasing against the Israelis in the region. The Israelis are trying to break out of the tit-for-tat dynamic. And given that the Islamic Republic, after 45 years, this April, burst out of the shadows and fought overtly and kinetically and directly from its own territory against the Israelis by firing over 300 projectiles, including ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, I think the imperative was very much sharpened for the Israelis to take the fight to the adversary in a way they had not done before. And in my view, this explains this change we've seen, this string of covert and overt military successes in rapid succession that are designed to put the adversary on the back foot and create this conundrum. And this conundrum, which is as true for Hezbollah in Lebanon, as well as the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in places like Iraq and Syria, as well as the clerical leadership in Tehran, is the same, which is or even the Houthis in Yemen, by the way, which is to say, you can either absorb the cost of this new operation against you, or if that forces you to respond in a way to save face, and you try to meet this now much more significant military operation threshold, and you try to meet and beat that expectation, you, in a bid to try to save face, could end up losing your head. So this is a way to both restore deterrence as well as to bring out that inner humiliation, that inner psychological element that can actually, again, get in the short term the adversary to get out and step into an area that they're not comfortable fighting in, and that the Israelis are quite comfortable fighting in, and get the adversary in the position to make more mistakes, to have their emotions rather than their strategies take over. And then ultimately, in the very long term, if the adversary doesn't do these things and they're sober and patient and strategic like the Islamic Republic, then it's to continue to be able to inflict a death by a thousand cuts approach on them, much like the Islamic Republic has been trying to inflict on Israel. And you might say, Behnam, this phenomenon is really brought to you by April 13, 14, or this is just a feature of the post-October 7 Middle East. Well, it actually has everything to do with the one big picture Middle East security issue that orients, animates all of us, and that's trying to stop Iran's dash to the bomb. Because unlike other regimes, this regime is not going for the nuclear weapon as quickly as possible. It's trying to go for it as safely as possible. And that really is where Hezbollah enters. Because Hezbollah, like many others, like John Hanna, like Mark Dubowitz, and many of our other friends and colleagues across Washington have said for many years, I think even in Israel, I've heard several folks say this over the years, Hezbollah has managed to create a North Korea, South Korea situation for the Islamic Republic, where just like North Korea can use conventional weapons to destroy Seoul, the conventional military threat and the asymmetric military threat that Hezbollah has been able to pose post-2006, brought to you almost entirely by an Iranian resupply and indigenization effort to create not just rockets and drones, but ballistic missiles and convert rockets into missiles through this PGM process, through the precision guided munitions process, to be able to put a knife to the neck of the Jewish state and then sharpen that knife over time. This is essentially what the Islamic Republic has been doing to get a conventional deterrent in place such that it can go for a nuclear deterrent. And if the Israelis or the Americans try to go for the nuclear deterrent and take that off the table, then the conventional deterrent is activated. So when you see now this pager, beeper, whatever you want to call it, covert operation through this lens, it is about weakening Hezbollah. It is about making sure that they know they cannot compete against the Israelis. And indeed, if they do begin to compete, they will lose their head. So making sure that Hezbollah is defanged is not just good policy for your northern border, is not just trying to restore Zionism, because lest we forget, this is, I think, and we have many people who know the history of Israel on the call better than I, this is the first time that Israel has actually had to move within its territory for a period of time. And this is how the Axis is taking a victory lap here. They're saying that the Israelis are not even operating on all of the territory that they claim is quote unquote occupied, that they have had to vacate towns and villages in the north, that there are 60 to 80,000 internally displaced people. These are not brief blips like you had in 67 or 73 where territory moved. This is a withdrawal from, you could call it Green Line Israel. And this is a major political accomplishment in the eyes of the Axis, particularly Lebanese Hezbollah and the Islamic Republic of Iran. So to be able to push back on that, it's not just good military policy or security strategy or proof of your doctrine or proof positive of your ideology, but it is actually a key tool you will need in helping signal credibility and resolve to stop the world's most dangerous regime, which is the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, from trying to safely as possible get the world's most dangerous weapons, which are nuclear weapons.
So what are your thoughts on what Iran's takeaway is from the past 2 days then? And look, Israel presumably successfully assassinated Haniyeh in Tehran. So what do you think Iran's takeaway is?
Based on the hardline media official statements I've been looking at coming out of Tehran, the Iranians haven't promised revenge for even what happened to their ambassador. And let me just bring in this bit of irony / poetic justice here. Iran's ambassador in Lebanon, and by the way, essentially all of Iran's regional ambassadors are run through the Quds Force rather than run through the foreign ministry. Iraq is the clearest example, Lebanon less, but they have a clear security prerogative. It's not just diplomatic prerogative they have. They're not just in the consular or visa business. These guys are about cementing political and military ties with the most successful export of the Islamic Revolution, and that is Lebanese Hezbollah. They haven't promised retaliation in that way. And that ambassador has lost, based on press reports, his eye, at least vision in one eye. And Iranians, both in the diaspora and on social media, have been felicitating this because we are now past the 2-year anniversary of the Women Life Freedom, the Zan Zendegi Azadi protests that were touched off by the killing of Mahsa Amini 2 years ago this September. In fact, this weekend, was the anniversary 2 years ago. And in the brutal crackdown that has ensued since, the regime's security forces has intentionally been targeting people's private parts and people's eyes with their bullets. So you have tons of blinded activists, dissidents, folks in jail, folks out of jail, the best and the brightest of the youth and of the next generation blinded. And once these folks saw that Iran's ambassador to Iraq, Iran's ambassador to Lebanon, this symbolic bridge between the IRGC and Hezbollah, also lost his vision, they felicitated this on social media. And it's just ironic that you see the people who live under the most anti-Israeli regime in the Middle East were felicitating this attack, and then a whole host of other people were saying, oh no, this was indiscriminate or whatnot. But all of that is, suffice to say, there's a massive gap between state and society in Iran. There's also a massive gap between the Arab street and the Iranian street on the Israel issue. And then for the purposes of your question, the Iranians didn't respond to the killing of Haniyeh. They're not likely to respond overtly to this. I don't think that's cause for a victory lap, even though they clearly know they are outgunned by the Israelis and the Americans. This is them looking at the chessboard, again, most unfortunately, since October 7 and saying, we're coming up on the anniversary. And I think the guys in Tehran are looking at the chessboard saying, things are going our way, don't mess it up. They're going to go back to the old model of, we'll take the hit. We'll risk the escalation ladder for the death by 1,000 cuts, because that takes time, and time, we believe, is on our side, not on Israel's side. And the Iranians are counting on everything from nuclear capability being grown in Iran to changes in American domestic politics arresting the success of Israel's military operations.
So let's then turn to your report now. In July, Secretary of State Tony Blinken announced that Iran's breakout was now 1 or 2 weeks. And in late July, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence issued a classified report on the advancement of Iran's nuclear weapons program. Senator Lindsey Graham said the report made him very worried that Iran, quote, could use these 3 or 4 months before our election to sprint to a nuclear weapon. And he warned, we have to put them on notice that cannot happen. Graham added in a July 31st press conference that, quote, after having viewed the DNI report, I believe it is a certainty that if we do not change course, Iran will, in the coming weeks or months, possess a nuclear weapon. So can you share with our audience what we know about Iran's nuclear weapons development and how we know it, given that the IAEA is no longer conducting inspections or permitted inside the relevant Iranian facilities? And why is the intelligence community, as well as your report, coming to the conclusion that prior to the election on November 5th, but certainly by Inauguration Day on January 20th, this may be a fait accompli?
It's because we can take a larger stock of the entire history of Iran's nuclear program. This was a program that, and just allow me to give a brief but important shout out and kudos to my 2 distinguished co-authors, folks who are also friends with Emmett, Mr. Brad Bowman and Mr. Orde Kittrie. Brad leads our Center on Military and Political Power, a scholar of all things military, a practitioner from the Army, used to teach at West Point. And then Orde Kittrie, who knows all things nonproliferation inside and out. He was a State Department lawyer for many years, focusing on these issues just tangentially, even as it relates to the Israel issue. Many years ago, he wrote a book published by Oxford University Press on lawfare. I highly recommend you read it with the perspective of time and distance and history. His writings in that book have proved even more prescient. It was an honor to pair up with these 2 distinguished gentlemen, and I brought some of the Iran, quote unquote, subject matter expertise to this distinguished mix, and we put together a very impactful, I think, 50 to 60 page report that we hope folks in Washington and you guys at home are able to read and digest and think through. But again, back to your question. It's because this regime developed a nuclear weapons program by resurrecting the program it inherited after first saying, no, we don't need nuclear technology. That's some Western mumbo jumbo. We're oil rich. And this was a waste of time that the late Shah embarked on during an 8-year war with its neighbor. And you don't go about resurrecting a science fair program amid a war that is a total war. They devoted time, they devoted men, they devoted assets, they devoted resources to build up a domestic capacity. They intentionally chose this method, gaseous enrichment for fissile material. So basically, centrifuges that could spin the uranium fast enough to purify it, to separate the isotopes, that would allow them in the 1990s, with more illicit procurement and more support in that time from Russia and China, to be able to move towards something of a cover for a nuclear weapon. And fait accompli is what the program was essentially all about. They had these covert facilities that were all across Iran that were designed to create, I think, several bombs worth. I think in the Atomic Archive, they captured treasure trove of material that the Islamic Republic still had on hand and that the Israelis bravely foisted from Iranian territory and showed the world in 2018, 2019. Iran wanted to have at least 5 bombs when it went public with this program. Now, when we look at the still very good IAEA reporting, International Atomic Energy Agency reporting, looking at the press reporting, looking at what the Iranians themselves are saying about their program, they're increasingly willing to dangle this threat of turning the final screw because, unfortunately, due to all of the missteps, Iran has made irreversible nuclear gains in the past few years. And we have to admit that when we're trying to counter and roll back this program. And at times like April 13, 14, and afterwards, in tough times, in braggadocious times, this regime is talking about basically having a nuclear capability already, a disassembled bomb, a bomb in the basement kind of idea, or being merely a screwdriver turn away, or having really assembled all they need for a nuclear weapon. And then as the world tries to stop them, they'll say, hey, you pushed me and I have to go for it now. And that is still the fait accompli that they want to create. Now, we can do things like bringing more assets into the region, signaling more kind of U.S. commitment as the U.S. has done since August 1st as it tried to deter a military response by Iran after the killing of Hania, which all signal resolve and capability and credibility. But the question is, how long can we sustain this over time? And one potential, not to get too political about it, but one potential fear is that if Iran does see a potential Trump presidency on the verge, it could actually double down to build more capacity to get even closer to the threshold, such that if there is a Trump administration that goes back to the policy that it had, which was maximum pressure, that they have more capacity, and more capacity equals more leverage. Even if one doesn't believe that they'll run and cross the threshold in rapid time, I don't. I simply think that they'll have the capability to do so, and they'll threaten it increasingly. And in the face of these threats, as we have fallen short in the face of Putin's nuclear threats, we too will fall short. So this is about making sure U.S. policymakers have everything that they need, such that when Tehran continues to creep, we call it out, we detect it, we deter it, and we punish it.
Okay, so the various intelligence assessments have concluded that Tehran's decisions are guided by a cost-benefit approach rather than a rush to a weapon, irrespective of the political, economic, and military costs. That's a quote from your report. Excuse me. So I'm going to be a bit cynical here, but with regard to deterrence, which we're going to get into more extensively, and given that this is different than, let's say, deterring an attack on our forces, which we could respond forcefully to, as your report indicates we did with attacks on our forces in Iraq and Syria, aren't we actually past the point of deterring them from breakout? And in particular, isn't this dire predicament the result of the past 3.5 years of the Biden-Harris policy of appeasement, coupled with the 8 years of Obama-Biden policy of empowerment, which has led to your report's statement that, quote, the Islamic Republic is apparently not currently persuaded that the United States has the will to launch the magnitude of attacks necessary to halt Iran's nuclear weapons program or to engage in other significant military action directly against Iran?
That is, unfortunately, one of the things that comes across when you study not just the facts on the ground with respect to the changing nuclear program, the evolving military program, the revolution in the long-range strike capabilities in the region, the increasing risk tolerance, the axis that's growing, the proxy capabilities, the footsie the regime is playing at the 500,000 foot level with America's near peer and great power competitors like Russia and China, unlike anything we've seen in the history of not just the Islamic Republic, but in the history of Iran. These are all game changers. And they're game changers that happened, unfortunately, again, on a much more permissive watch under the administrations past and present that you mentioned. There have been revolutions in the knowledge-based capabilities that the regime has been able to make, unfortunately, revolutions that have happened since 2021. And I, for one, still believe that because there is a cost-benefit approach, one reason the regime hasn't gone for the bomb all the way today is because we've guided them away from that they still believe, at least when it comes to risk reward, that they may have more to lose than more to gain. But conversely, as we've failed in the region, as we've fumbled on a whole host of issues, as we've put more distance between us and our most important strategic ally and partner in the region, Israel, it's created more room for the Islamic Republic to exploit. And this thing is not like a light switch, not on, not off. It's all like a measure of volume. And That's why the report focuses so heavily on the policy options. Where can we actually, as the regime goes to turn that volume up, where can we go to force them to turn that volume down? And this is really the word operating in the background here. And we have to be intellectually honest. This is a regime that lies, that has cheated, that has stolen, that has repressed its own population, that engages in foreign aggression abroad. And as we say in the report, has not really changed its foreign and security policy. It's been relatively consistent. There have been successes for deterrence on the military front, political front, economic front in the past. Those are lessons that we actually flesh out in case studies in the report, draw some real core philosophies from, and then apply towards the future. But because it's so consistent, we know that still, just like in the 80s and just like in 2024, a nuclear weapon unfortunately still suits this regime's strategic interests. And because of that, that magic S word that this report is all about, and that hopefully a new administration can take to heart, is about shaping. You have to shape their choices. And the Israelis have actually been quite good at shaping some of the choices of the Islamic Republic. And there are lots of places where we have to take a page from their playbook and apply it to bigger picture, bigger ticket items to shape the choices of the Islamic Republic, to make sure that when they're faced with this risk reward, cost benefit approach, they will have much more to fear than much more to gain. And just by way of one small example, and we can get into it, in 2022, it was proven that the Islamic Republic gave drones to Russia. In the same time, in that reporting period, the US had warned that the regime could give ballistic missiles to Russia. Now, the US has said that they have transferred, that the Iranians have transferred ballistic missiles to Russia. Clearly, there was a deterrence deficit in these 2 years, meaning that which we did to punish the drone proliferation was insufficient to deter the missile proliferation. And this should be a case study in what didn't work.
So the other party that apparently hasn't been deterred is Russia, because it's my understanding that Russia may be providing Iran with nuclear technology, maybe assisting the Iran to reach the finish line, or the fait accompli. So what are your thoughts on the exchange of technological and military advancements between those two countries?
This is one area where, and I may have said this in the past, and I apologize if I did, we are so spoiled in the West by the definition of an ally, particularly post-World War II, this liberal international order that everyone seems to talk about, but no one can define. We think that an ally has to look alike, think alike, talk alike, feel alike. We want all the NATO countries to be democracies. We want the Five Eyes countries, well, they all are Commonwealth countries. They speak English. There's a cultural tradition. From most of the world, from Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War up until the end of World War II, an ally simply meant a person or an entity that was shooting in the same direction as you for a sustained period of time, and that's it. And that's the way that the Russia-Iran and Russia-China relationship has been blossoming. They're shooting in the same direction. They both are shooting at America and the American-aligned order, which they believe has artificially created a balance of power in the region that does not favor them. And they are more, because they're revisionist states, keen to overturn this regional balance through military force. Iran unconventionally, Russia conventionally. And like a Venn diagram, the part that's in the middle and is unfortunately growing is this revisionism and anti-Americanism, which is a very toxic brew. And it is bolstering a lot of these changes and risk-taking that we see from the Russians in their region and the Iranians in their region. And then ultimately, given the successes they've had in places like Syria, they're building and they're moving from a formerly turbulent, when you look at the past 500 years of Iranian and Russian history, to the more recent era transactional history of Iran and Russia. And they're moving into the third era, which is the transformational era. And this transformational era, with major Iranian assistance to the Russian effort in Ukraine, plus, what you mentioned that could potentially be happening on the nuclear front, is a game changer. Because as Russia's geopolitics change, its non-proliferation strategy will also change. There were actually some non-proliferation successes in the Clinton administration to clip Russia's wings and to limit the nature of its support to Iran's nuclear program. Russia has helped Iran with its light water reactor in Bushehr in the southwest of the country. They provide the fuel, they take away the spent fuel. Okay, now they're creating more reactors. That's a problem. They were part of the negotiations that led to the JCPOA. Technically, they were part of the redesign of the Fordo facility, which failed by 2019 when the Iranians began to violate their nuclear commitments under the JCPOA. They voted for 5 major UN Security Council resolutions that sanctioned the Islamic Republic. Their old model was, we'll sell Iran out, but we'll sell Iran out at the right price. And now they're not so keen on selling Iran out. In fact, they're being Iran's lawyers on the IAEA Board of Governors. They're being Iran's lawyers on the Security Council. That's the imperative of snapback, actually, because after 2025, we won't even have a diplomatic option against the Iranians because of this increasing Russian veto. So that is the major accomplishment number one, that the Russians will serve as basically a legal human shield against diplomatic pressure against Iran. Number two, on the nuclear front specifically, we don't know where, but we can guess that the Russian support would be key on, and that would probably on the weaponization front. There were reports this summer about computer modeling and metallurgy. Axios had revealed that the Islamic Republic was slowly starting to engage in. We don't know modeling of what and metallurgy of what, but potentially if it has something to do with bomb design or warhead miniaturization, that's a major red flag. But those are things that the Russians have done in the past quite significantly. And they could help the Iranians with connecting these final dots for weaponization. My focus on missiles. One area that the Russians could significantly help the Iranians on is the re-entry vehicle technology and re-entry vehicle design. That's for the warhead of these missiles that re-enters the atmosphere at super fast speeds, and it has to survive the heat and the rigors of re-entry. So the Russians can help, again, God forbid, but with re-entry survivability and potential ablative material and technologies to make sure these re-entry vehicles work and can deliver the payload at these distances. And then as the DIA has said last year, the Defense Intelligence Agency and current CIA Director Burns has also hinted at, the assistance could be given as well on the space program, which is not just a space program, it's a military space program that's a cover for a longer range strike capability that is designed to be able to threaten a nuclear attack against the European continent and, again, God forbid, the American homeland. And the Iranians have a robust space program. It's run by the IRGC as well as the civilian Iranian Space Agency, which is managed by the Iranian Ministry of Defense, so not so civilian. The Iranian Space Agency focuses on larger liquid propellant systems. The IRGC focuses on medium to large solid propellant systems. They just launched a 3-stage all solid propellant space launch vehicle. This is basically something you could reconfigure and develop into a intermediate range ballistic missile and then a intercontinental ballistic missile. Oh, and by the way, all they would need for that reconfiguration, minus some other things on the thrust side and the throw weights and the phasing there, is to be able to have re-entry vehicle design and survivability. And again, that could be something the Russians help with.
So I'm going to get into some of the recommendations you make on a military deterrence basis. But before that, one of your report's recommendations on deterrence was that President Biden should make an unambiguous statement, such as the following, quote, "If Iran takes additional decisive steps towards producing a nuclear bomb, I will use military force to destroy Iran's nuclear program and impose crippling costs on the regime, including by destroying other targets important to it." And then the report recommends that, particularly during this election season and the transition period, that other top officials and candidates should also be issuing strong statements. What I've seen, again, talking about deterrence, is that this administration has spent more time deterring Israel from defending itself post 10/7, including stopping it from a preemptive attack against Hezbollah, calling for ceasefires, and threatening Israel that if it enters Khan Yunis, and then, of course, Rafah, that Harris said that there would be consequences if Israel went into Rafah. So Israel, it's been slowed down, but it hasn't been deterred. So even if the Biden or Harris were to issue these statements, would Iran be deterred by anything that they say at this point?
There's nothing monocausal here. There's not one thing the U.S. can do that'll change Iran's calculus. It really is a cocktail approach, and sinking considerable and credible political costs is going to be one key step. Now, someone can say, hey, Behnam, Obama sunk some pretty critical and credible costs when he opened his mouth, and he had those very famous lines about the Syrian red line way back in 2013, if you remember. And John Kerry was out to the right, and Obama was out to the left. Our partners, our allies, and even our adversaries didn't know what was the official US position. It was really something to be studied for the textbooks on a deterrence disaster, basically what not to do for political messaging. And someone could easily bring that case to me and say, hey, Behnam, isn't this a problem? Why would they believe us now when we sunk those costs then? And look what happened with Syria. The former President Obama was saying for many years, Assad must go. And fast forward 10, 15 years later, and the Iranians and the Russians have won there, and Assad has stayed. So this is a major problem. And the way I get around that is to say, A, there have been multiple American presidents, Bush, Obama, Trump, and even Biden with the Jerusalem Declaration, which I believe was in 2022, have been very clear about their intent to stop an Iranian nuclear weapon. This adds to that clarity and thinks further costs across generations of different American leaders of different parties that have shared this vision. And so it's important for Biden to be able to plant a flag here so that the next person who comes along, whether that's President Kamala Harris or President Donald Trump, can build on that. So it's not like it's just an architecture that exists out of thin air, something Obama said to be contradicted by Kerry, or something Kerry said to be contradicted by Obama, and it remains quarantined, and generations of Americans have not touched Syria since then. This has been something that generations of American presidents have focused on, have tried to prevent at all costs, and the next generation of American presidents will have to focus on and try. So this is about correctly getting the baton that they've received and correctly handing it off. And in this sense, this at least begins to credibly communicate to the Iranians that despite different people, despite different ascendant ideologies, despite different parties, this is a baseline American national security interest. And if one takes the definition of an interest as something that you are willing to fight, kill, and die for, then it is something that the US is going to be trying to stop using all of its tools of national power. It doesn't mean that you have to call for militarism overnight. I am not calling for an overt and unprecedented and preemptive or preventive strike on Iran's nuclear program. But you have to understand that this regime, as evidence in the case studies, only backs down on a limited handful of times. And force was a critical ingredient in all of those handfuls of times. And if that force is not believed to be credible, then we're going to have a major problem, not just with the Iranians, but much more bigger and important and dangerous actors on the international stage, like the Russians and Chinese.
So let me ask you this. What does it say? What message does it send to Iran that the Biden-Harris administration has been withholding certain very critically important military equipment and munitions, including the 2,000-pound bombs, which Israel desperately needs to execute a war with Hezbollah, let alone if it had to go after Iran on its own? Your report recommends providing Israel with various military equipment, but isn't the U.S. sending a different message? And does Israel have the ability to do this on its own if this Biden-Harris administration's policy of trying to limit a more aggressive Israeli military action to secure its own national security, how does that deter Iran?
Unfortunately, it doesn't deter Iran. As you mentioned in the previous question, I think it is designed to deter Israel. And what we need to do is rectify that. So that which was withheld now has to be provided. That which is supposed to be provided should be expedited. And we even come up with ideas where there could be loans or rotations of certain things. And that which needs to be produced needs to be started to be produced in overtime so that they have enough, for example, of the Tamir interceptors to deal with this short-range threat that exists on their borders that could be, God forbid, activated in a way that is already more activated given the multiple fronts that Israel is already fighting on, the defense Iran-backed attacks that are projectiles coming from Hezbollah, projectiles coming from the Houthis in Yemen, you name it. This is just on a logistics level, very important to provide. Now moving from logistics to politics and strategy, if you signal that you are willing, when push comes to shove, to restrain your friend rather than restrain your adversary, then your adversary who is fighting your friend is going to be much more keen on continuing the fight because they know the more they escalate, the more they drag it out, the more they can count on your restraint rather than on your resolve to enter the fight. And we've seen this. And there's a clear nuclear lesson to be learned here as well, is that the Islamic Republic has to threaten the potential for a wider war. And once that potential is threatened, as we've seen in the month of August, for example, that kicks the Biden administration into high gear in the month of August, the attempts to prevent some of the Israeli military successes. And even at the time of when the hostage bodies were recovered, to still blame the Israelis for the lack of any kind of movement on a potentially newer hostage deal. These all teach very bad lessons to an adversary that is increasingly willing to escalate, because it means when push comes to shove, those two famous D words that the administration keeps using, deterrence and de-escalation, that no matter how many times the Israelis prioritize deterrence, the Americans will prioritize de-escalation. And that means first handcuffing their friend rather than handcuffing their adversary. And that is a lesson that is going to take a lot of time to get the Iranians to unlearn.
But since the issuance of your report, the Biden-Harris administration has announced its intent to pull U.S. forces out of Iraq. Obama tried that. It was disastrous. We went back in. And now they're, from what I understand, developing this strategy to get all the U.S. forces out by 2027, I believe, and making it impossible for Trump to reverse that, and however they implement this. That basically is handing Iraq over to Iran, is it not? And then, of course, that helps build that land bridge to the Mediterranean that Iran has been developing. What is the implications of this?
The implications are gross and significant, and you use the L word there, land bridge. Me and another colleague at FDD, David Adesnik, had actually put out a big report on this in 2019. We called it, I think, Burning Bridge, architecture for a permissive environment through a whole series of failed states in the region to bring men, money, and munitions closer to Israel's doorstep. So this was the logistics and the geopolitics of how Iran is now able to orchestrate a multi-front war. The failure of being able to crack down on it then got us in this position today. So we have to now stem the bleeding, triage the bleeding, and then reverse the losses. And continuing along this path, vis-a-vis what you mentioned in Iraq, would only be expediting the gains for the other side, most unfortunately. You may have seen a story a little while ago about the Houthis and some of the other proxies of Iran trying to open up shop, or allegedly opening up shop in Baghdad. This is because Iran has what the French call, or what the UN calls, like a laissez-passer. They have an international travel passport jurisdiction in Iraq. It's a permissive environment for them. They've punctured the state, they've punctured civil society, they've punctured the economy, they've punctured religious institutions. They've even, as you see more recently, punctured Kurdish autonomy in the north. That's going to have some drastic implications for even if we do have a diminished or entirely gone footprint or force presence in the region there. But the lack of an Iraq policy currently, even under the Biden-Harris administration, helps get Iran into this place. And while some of the assets that we do call for need to be positioned elsewhere, perhaps not so close to Iran's borders, this, I think, would be an own goal and would be clear proof of 6 days the government killed 1,500 people. In that time, it wasn't just, I think it was the Washington Post has the phrase, democracy dies in the darkness. It wasn't just democracy that was dying in the darkness. It was the Iranian people that was dying in the darkness. So we need to get serious about making sure there is critical telecommunication support to the best and the bravest and the brightest that are out there. And a policy that also fleshes out and puts the spotlight on, through opposition media and other means, the shortcomings, which are persistent and consistent from this regime, to make sure that the Iranian people know about the failings of their own government consistently over time, and then making sure that when they are out into the streets, they know that the West or others will have their back. And unfortunately, I do not see that architecture in place today. There are some actual good moves more recently on the Senate side and the House side about internet freedom and VPNs and things like that with respect to Iran, but that's just the price floor. We need to really increase this because much of the threats that we face from this region, the terrorism threat, the nuclear threat, the cyber threat, the illicit shipping and the illicit procurement threat, all of these, all roads lead back to the Islamic Republic. And any other thing is just a time buying mechanism or a containment policy. It's not a rollback policy. So we have to be intellectually honest that the heart of the problem is the regime. And it's time to focus on a more comprehensive strategy that can tackle the regime, first by handicapping it, and then by finding a way to create some kind of evolution there that gets those best and the brightest to actually get a government that reflects their views and values and interests. Since 2009, Iranians have been chanting, not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life only for Iran. You couldn't have a sharper contrast between what the Iranian people have been saying and doing versus what the Iranian government has been saying and doing since then.
Thanks, Behnam. I actually have a couple of my own questions that I'm going to skip to get to the audience questions since we only have a couple minutes left. And a couple people are asking, given the need to return to the North and this spectacular attack with the pagers and the walkie-talkies, why hasn't the IDF initiated a significant operation against Hezbollah on the heels of that attack? Isn't this the perfect window to do? And to tack on to that question, what message do you believe that the success of this attack sends to Israel's Arab allies? And is that a renewal that they see Israeli deterrence back in the region?
I think it's on the latter point. I certainly think it shows, again, the sophistication of the Israeli intelligence apparatus and the willingness of the Israelis to try to break out of this tit for tat game that Hezbollah has been trying to lure them into. So again, in my view, and I think in the words of Lee Smith, who coined this when he wrote the book, The Strong Horse, again, it signals to many Arab states that Israel has the capability to be the strong horse and that this is where they need to throw their lot in, to borrow a phrase. On the front end of your question, I'm not sure, because that's what I thought as well. One would have thought that as the baseline or the commencement, or as the Israelis were thinking about wider or deeper military operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon, this would have been something to help neutralize Lebanese Hezbollah's forces and operatives and to erode them of a ground game and to add on to benefit of surprise, add on to the shock factor, which was basically the surprise, these explosions. That to date has not materialized. Who knows if more kind of overt and direct military activity will be something that the Israelis will pair on to this. There's always, of course, the theory that, of course, this could have been, again, to try to get Hezbollah to break out of the tit for tat itself by trying to save face and then lose its own head. Thus far, we know, I think Reuters has reported that Hezbollah has fired at, I think, artillery positions of the IDF in the north. So perhaps not such a big breakout, but we'll have to watch this northern front for a very long time now, particularly since the cabinet has said that it's now part of the national security aims of this larger regional war to restore those displaced persons to the north.
Someone asked, and I'd love to hear your response to this. In hindsight, was it a mistake for the U.S. to leave the JCPOA?
No, because everything that we fear now and everything that the regime is doing now is rendered legal by the JCPOA. The best case argument for the JCPOA, and again, I wasn't a fan of the manner in which the US left the deal, even though many people still think that the Trump administration left the deal because of Iranian violations. No, that's not the case at all. The Trump administration left the deal because it assessed that remaining in the deal, the risk reward, the cost benefit of kicking the can down the road through these sanctions waivers was not worth, the juice was not worth the squeeze. The time that you buy necessarily wasn't getting you that peace dividend. And worst of all, it was allowing Khamenei to build this legal and political argument for a much larger, expanded nuclear program over time. So if you have a problem with, pardon me, sorry about that. If you have a problem with increasing Iranian enrichment activity, you should have a problem with the JCPOA. If you have a problem with increased centrifuges being tested and then being brought online, you should have a problem with the JCPOA. If you have an issue with Iranian arms transfers, the fact that there are drones, Iranian drones on 4 different continents today, you should have a problem with the JCPOA. If you have a problem with Iranian ballistic missile testing and use and transfers, you should have a problem with the JCPOA. All of those things are rendered legal by the JCPOA and UN Security Council Resolution 2231. So staying in it wouldn't have prevented those things. It would have legalized those things. Leaving the JCPOA, admittedly, brought some of them forward. The regime began to violate it and began to do those things on an earlier clock. But at least that allowed you more diplomatic room for maneuver, which, as you can see, is already exceptionally limited before we even get to the 10-year mark, as well as more time for our sanctions to bite.
I want to ask, since we're talking about this very critical time period between the election and inauguration day. What, and I know you don't have a looking glass where you can actually see the answer to this, but what are the real chances? And is it based on who wins? Iran breaking out between November 5th and January 20th? And really, how concerned should we be?
There is a chance, but we don't know what we don't know. And I have not been privy to the classified version of the report that Lindsey Graham saw, or the classified version of the Special National Intelligence Estimate that came out. We don't know what we don't know about those final steps of Iranian weaponization, nor about the willingness of this regime to be comfortable with what they could announce that they could produce in that limited period of time between November and January. So with that being said, my biggest fear, and that which I think we need to offset from now till the November election and November until January 21st, is the regime engaging in more of these low-level weaponization activities that the net effect is basically trying to create a bomb in the basement. There is a very real threat that they could sprint. I wouldn't put, if you ask me, we didn't put this estimate in the report, I wouldn't put that number at a double-digit number between November and January. They could sprint to a bomb. I would put it at a single-digit number. But nonetheless, a single-digit number is still quite significant when you look at threshold status or the near threshold status that the regime has already been able to achieve. The fact that they are getting the strategic dividends of nuclear deterrence without already having a nuclear weapon today is a problem, such that if they fear that things are not going their way and they ultimately do go for the bomb, then heaven help us then in trying to constrain and roll back and deter this regime. So that's why we have to take stock of how the regime has not just in word, but indeed slowly crept forward on some of this weaponization stuff this year. While the world was focused on October 7 and the region, they have made some significant and irreversible gains here, and gains that at least the regime was hoping were deniable, because based on the Axios reports from June and July, it made it look like, oh no, these were scientists on a lower level engaging in these activities rather than a formal go order from the top. Let's hope that day for the formal go order from the top never comes, but hope is not a strategy. What we have to do is to shape the risk-reward ratio and to make sure this regime knows it will lose everything, including itself, that it holds dear, should that risk-reward ratio change. And that's what the outgoing Biden administration has to do and needs to do with respect a much better job of. And that's what either candidate has to do. The candidate Kamala and candidate Trump have to do. And all three of them can begin by digging deeply into the policy section of this report to begin to understand how to change this psychology of the regime, and then alter after that the risk-reward ratio.
To everybody that has questions in the queue, if you'd like to email them to us, we would be happy to forward them to Behnam, because there's a couple questions that are a little more technical that maybe perhaps Behnam you would be able to answer, and we could forward to the audience member. I can't thank you enough, as always, for your brilliant insights and taking the time to be with us here at AMET. We greatly appreciate it. And the report is in the chat for everybody. It's extremely important, and I hope that you all read it and also pass this webinar recording along to friends, family, colleagues. It's critically important time right now. Again, thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Much appreciated. And we will see you all next week. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you so much.